Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this second seminar. I thoroughly enjoyed the first, and I'm really looking forward to the conversations we're about to have, not least because this is such an international audience, each of us listening and speaking from very different settings. And I'm sure that, as Fletcher prayed just now, we are, in our own minds, the challenges of seeking just government and promoting the common good against so many odds must have been forefront in each of our minds. So thank you both to Elsie and Fletcher for opening our session. So in less than 15 minutes, that's my brief, I want to try to give some highlights of the parts of the book dealing with the themes of secularism and highlight some key questions that we may want to raise. And then I look forward to Renato's response. So first of all, let me just try to spell out the different senses in which the word secular or secularism is typically used in public debate. Just briefly to distinguish four different senses of the secular or secularism, which is the foundation for what I go on then to say. And the reason I bother to do this in the book is because the term is thrown around as a word to champion or as a scare word so much in public debate, and it's often completely unclear what it is that different protagonists have in mind. So here, four different senses. There is first the secular, the saeculum, which goes back to the Middle Ages, indeed into the pre-Christian era, and that term means the age between the incarnation and the eschaton. It's a thoroughly theological idea. And often when Catholics especially use the term secular, this is what they mean. They don't mean godless or divorced from religion. So in Christianity, there is, strictly speaking, no secular realm in the sense of a realm divorced from God. There's no ontological division between the secular and the sacred. There is not a secular space in that sense. Rather, there is a secular time, the time between the incarnation and the eschaton. But it is a time when God is fully present to the world, active in redeeming his creation, calling the church into being and to witness to his lordship across every area of life. So that's a positive sense of the term secular, that theological idea of the saeculum. Then there is the much more modern idea, secularism as a faith, as a worldview, a comprehensive belief and action orientation that guides persons and indeed cultures, committed to a particular view of human meaning, of the source of morality, of the purpose of human existence, of the meaning of history, and so forth. That's the worldview, as we know, which has become dominant in the modern West and through the West, the rest of the world, in the last 200, 300 years. Come back to that a bit later. But now people also talk of us being in a post-secular age. That's an interesting term. It's a problematic term in some ways, but I take it to mean a post-secular age is when a secularist faith is simply no longer the default worldview. In other words, where it can be challenged, where it can be put into question. And I think we certainly are now entering signs of a post-secular age. So that's the second. The secular as the saeculum, secularism as a faith. Thirdly, secularization as a societal process. And here, let me briefly distinguish three different senses of secularization. Sociologists have been arguing about this for a very long time. The first is simply a fall off in religious belief, fewer people believing and practicing religious commitments. Clearly, that's pervasive in most Western societies and is ongoing. Then there is the sense of secularization as privatization. That is not just the decline in personal belief, but the decline in the public significance of religion, its public presence and influence and standing. What we're seeing today, though, in many Western settings and beyond, is in fact the opposite of that, what sociologists call deprivatization, where religious communities that had often remained in the private realm, as it were, practicing their faith either simply in their personal lives or behind the doors of their religious buildings, are now moving out back into society and attempting to shape it according to their faith. That's deprivatization. And the third sense of secularization is institutional differentiation. That's not the same thing as privatization. It means the gradual branching off over the last 200, 300, 400 years, the branching off of different institutions from each other, so that each, as it were, comes into its own to pursue its own purposes, not subordinate to or intimately tied to the purposes of other institutions. And from a Christian perspective, at least from a Reform perspective, that can be seen as a wholesome development, because it allows the vocation, the distinctive calling of each institution better to be pursued. Last thing I want to say on this is that differentiation in that sense does not imply either privatization or religious decline. That's a very important claim, and it is increasingly being recognized by sociologists who work on these things. Many are now affirming differentiation as a fundamental feature of the modern world that we want to protect, but not thereby implying that it must require a reduction in religious belief or the privatization of faith. Indeed, as religion now begins to re-enter the public realm through deprivatization, there appears new possibilities for faith communities to shape these differentiated institutions, not just the state, but the business community, the arts community, the educational community, and so forth. So we are now in a very interesting post-secularized society, or rather post-secular society, to be more precise, in which new possibilities for faith-based presence and witness emerge. That's all secularization. Fourth sense of secular that I want to distinguish, and this is my usage in the book, is what I call jurisdictional secularism, or a secular state in the narrower sense. Jurisdictional secularism is an attempt to respect the different jurisdictions of church and state, or of religious organizations generally, and the state. And I propose it as a positive model for Christian political engagement. It's one aspect of a wider Christian conception of a limited state, a state which has specific purposes, but whose authority does not extend beyond those very specific purposes. And in Christian political thought, several such limits are affirmed, such as the rule of law, the dispersal of state power across different institutions, the independent authority of non-state organizations, those in civil society, personal liberty. All of these are different ways in which the Christian tradition has attempted to limit and specify the purpose of the state. Jurisdictional secularism is simply another of those limits. And it holds that the state cannot claim the authority to define ultimate truths. That's its fundamental commitment. Because of that, the state steps back and leaves those fundamental questions of ultimate truth to others, to individuals and to organizations in civil society, including, of course, churches and other religious organizations. And then it commits itself to protecting all law-abiding faiths equally, not favoring or privileging or disfavoring any one. And it also commits to positively engaging with those faith communities. Because strictly speaking, an impartial state, which is what I propose, does not guarantee a positive attitude towards religion. you could treat all faiths impartially and lock them all up behind the doors of a church, or suppress them all. That would be an impartial treatment of different religions. So, coupled with impartiality, there must be a positive affirmation of the place of religious organizations in the public realm. Now, I think Christians should agree with this sense of a secular state, jurisdictional secularism. It does not mean a secularist state in the sense of a state committed to furthering a secularist faith. So that's the first area I want to briefly talk about. Moving on quickly, second is to expand further what that means for the notion of democratic pluralism and what that has to say about a Christian nation as an alternative model. So a religiously impartial state will strive to allow a pluralism of different convictions to exist in society. Different thinkers have given this a different name. Jim Skillen calls it principled pluralism or confessional pluralism. Os Guinness calls it chartered pluralism. The name I use in the book is democratic pluralism because I want to emphasize the intimate connection between the pluralism side of that phrase and the democratic side. So, as I was saying last time, in a constitutional democracy, the people play an indispensable role in the political community as a whole. A constitutional democracy must be both a representative democracy and a participatory democracy. It must allow widespread civil liberties, a plurality of political parties, a fair electoral system, robust civil society participation, and so forth. All of that to allow the voices of the people to be adequately expressed in the political realm. But notice I said voices. The people do not speak with one voice, but with many voices. There are different interests that the people want to voice towards their governments: class interests, economic interest, regional interests, and so forth. But the people also have divergent moral and political convictions. And these too must be allowed expression within democracy if we are to respect the people as they are and not as we would wish them to be. Well, the outcome of such a democratic pluralism is a vigorous and argumentative and noisy democracy. It could be a turbulent democracy. A democracy that will not seek imposed consensus by excluding dissenting voices, but will allow consensus where it does emerge to emerge slowly out of robust, patient debate, which is especially attentive to marginalized voices. So that's my model as I propose. There are a number of Christians, indeed a growing number of Christians today, who are uneasy with that model or simply reject it. And I want to give these the name Christian nation advocates. You will probably recognize them in your own country. They show up everywhere, as you would expect. And many of them do very good work. And often we can be allies, I think, of such people. So, I propose that it is possible for citizens to share certain basic commitments to constitutional and democratic principles and practices, and yet to allow different faith-level groundings of these principles and practices. That's not to say that these principles and practices are neutrally grounded, but rather that they can be mutually endorsed. Now, the Christian nation view rejects this. It argues that we need to have an explicit public preference for Christianity if those principles and practices are to be sustained over time. Now, one of the problems with this view, there are several, is that nations can actually officially confess a faith, on the analogy with a person. That they're capable of what I call in the book corporate religious agency. Let me make two comments on that. The first is that, in my view, nations are sprawling cultural amalgams which do not exercise agency at all. That's the first point. The second is that states which can exercise agency they can, and they do sometimes try to exercise corporate religious agency. An officially Islamic state does, for example. So historically, that is very frequently the case. I'm arguing that it's illegitimate for them to do so. In the book, I offer a series of biblical arguments as to why I reached that conclusion, and it's to do with a radical shift in the place of the nation in God's redemptive work in the New Testament. And very briefly, in the New Testament, the people of God are no longer found in territorial nations, but they are constituted as the transnational body of Christ, called to witness to God's purposes for the state everywhere, but not to enlist the state officially behind that mission of witness. The task instead is for Christians to bring public influence to bear from the bottom up in their lives as individuals and through their participation in many different civil society institutions. It is the case, of course, that historically we can point to certain nations as having been formed by Christianity. Britain would be one example, for all its faults, but that does not itself prove that it is legitimate today to officially brand a state or a nation as Christian. Okay, moving on very quickly, let me just say a little bit more about the wrong kind of secularism. So, the pluralist democracy that I'm proposing will resist those forms of secularism that seek to keep faith-based political convictions out of democracy. Hence, I call it exclusivist secularism. It has an excluding agenda. And there are 4 assumptions of exclusivist secularism which I want to highlight, and they're all intersecting and mutually supporting. The first is that faith-based arguments in politics are inherently irrational, whereas secularist ones are rational. Now, I won't say much about that. I don't think I need to persuade you of why I disagree with that. Just to say that is now being widely challenged, not just by religious people, but by many post-secular voices or post-modern voices, post-colonial voices, who simply point out that that view fundamentally delegitimates their own traditions of reflection and action. That's the first. The second is that faith is inherently divisive, whereas secularist convictions unite everyone, or at least all reasonable citizens. The third is that faith-based reasoning is inherently partisan, whereas secularist reasoning is neutral. So only secularist types of reasoning can secure the impartial state which both secularists and I want to propose. That's their view. So, for example, secularist principles of justice, they claim, are fair to all, such as in a system of equal human rights. It offers equal protection irrespective of people's different identities or interests. Now, next time, I'm going to talk about why that's problematic, and point out that the expanding reach of equality rights across many public sectors now is intruding into personal conscience and associational autonomy. I'll say more about that next time. And the fourth assumption of this exclusivist secularism is that faith convictions diminish people's commitment to politics. It wraps them up in a larger loyalty which distracts them from civic life, whereas secularist convictions release people's moral energies. It puts them to work in building a just state. Now, in fact, I think today, arguably the reverse of that is now true. that the moral energies we need to sustain a pluralist democracy are more and more emerging from religious communities rather than from secularist communities, not always in wholesome ways. So, to conclude, we need to defend then an open democratic forum in which many faith-based voices and others can be respectfully heard and which can be allowed to shape law and public policy in significant ways, but in which none of those voices enjoy constitutional or political privilege. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Renato.
Yeah, thank you, Bruce. Well, I first came across Dr. Chaplin's works when I was starting to read about Abraham Kuyper and Herman Dooyeweerd. And it was from there that Chaplin's work started to be a part of my life. Every now and then I come across something that he has written and where he explains, clarifies, and objectively articulates how Christians should approach their faith when acting in the public sphere. So being here, having this responsibility to respond to Dr. Chaplin's work has a special flavor, and I'm honored to have been called to participate in this, so thank you. Well, faith in democracy has a clear scope. It is about democracy as the framework under which diversity can be accommodated in public life, but it is also about having faith participate in democracy to promote and accommodate diversity in the public square and public debate. If we are to have genuine democracy, we need the genuine participation of all individuals in their genuine self. That is, bringing to the public square everything that constitutes what they are, religion included. As said in the title, and as affirmed in its initial pages, the book aims to frame a politics of deep diversity. Politics, in Althusius' classic definition, is the art of consociandi, that is, associating men for the purpose of establishing, cultivating, and conserving social life among them. So the object of framing politics, as the subtitle of the book suggests the book will do, necessarily relates to life in the public sphere, to people associating, coming together, living together, all with a certain purpose. It is a teleological enterprise. The framing of politics, then, is the arrangement of the necessary support for this associational enterprise to occur. It lays down the basis upon which the pillars of communal public life will be edified. And this, as the title suggests, is democracy, but not any democracy. It must be a democracy that includes faith, beliefs, and convictions as an integral part of the public debate. It is the democratic pluralism within the broader constitutional democracy. As already discussed, Dr. Chaplin supports a constitutional democracy. So constitutional democracy here is the system where people's voices are expressed as an indispensable part of the polity, where there are multiple channels of popular participation to guarantee that participation in the public realm. Of course, this does not entail absolute participation, for constitutional boundaries will still be in place. But nonetheless, it is through this broad and indispensable voices of the people that the polity will be framed to achieve its public good and justice. And this leads to the main focus of our webinar today. If people voices are indispensable, if constitutional democracy still places burdens and limits on public discourse, and if it is this framework that will make individuals and society flourish, should we allow for faith, religious beliefs and convictions to be a part of this context? Wouldn't this have the opposite effect of bringing division instead of accommodating deep diversity? Or in other words, shouldn't we have the public arena to be secular? That question, Dr. Chaplin, I think, would say has a fatal problem, because secularism, at least in one sense, is a faith, or at least, as the book highlights, a worldview, an ideology, a meta-narrative, or a comprehensive doctrine. In this particular point, even if not expressly, Dr. Chaplin turns to Dooyeweerd's rejection of any neutrality claims. In Dooyeweerd's conception, the pre-theoretical attitude is essentially religious, whether through religion or idolatrous. There's no middle ground. Your worldview, ideology, or ethos is based either on the capital O origin of all things, or an idolatrous one. Dr. Chaplin seems to agree because on page 59, he says that any chain of substantive argumentation about the human good is a prior commitment either to religious revelation or to some secular substitute. So secularism or exclusivist secularism, therefore, is no new thing. It is faith dressed as neutrality in the public sphere. It is in its sense a faith-like commitment, a belief system about ultimate things, a counterfeit religion with its own gods, doctrines, and principles and priests. So when it comes to the state, Dr. Chaplin promotes a defense of what he calls jurisdictional secularism, as he was just referring. Jurisdictional secularism is a species of political secularism that separates religion from the state to shield society from divisive religious conflicts. However, differently from other types of political secularism that are hostile to religion, jurisdictional secularism prevents the state from becoming the arbiter of the legitimacy of a religious belief. As Dr. Chaplin put on page 65, the core of jurisdictional secularism is the institutional intent to treat plural faiths impartially and the existence of principles and procedures that make that outcome more likely than not. So he defends a type of secularism that is not exclusivist. It is a tamed form of secularism. It is about parity in the acknowledgement and treatment of religious individuals and institutions by the state. It seems like Aaron Kuyper's campaign slogan was right all along: parity, not privilege. I think Dr. Chaplin's point is perfectly clear here. However, at the beginning of chapter 4, there's a description of a case decided by the South Dakota Supreme Court, where Justice Henderson quoted the Bible as part of his honor's opinion. And here Chaplin says at page 80 that his citation of the biblical text to support his legal reasoning is what most painfully offends our democratic sensibilities, especially our commitment to the principle of religious impartiality of the state. I understand what Dr. Chaplin claims here, but I wonder if this is as irreconcilable with the jurisdictional secularism as the phrase that I just read entails. Dr. Chaplin says that these restrictions apply to state officials, but not to individuals or their representatives. I wonder if that would be possible then to expand a bit more on that today. And of course, I'm not here supporting the decision of Justice Henderson or its basis. I'm only questioning if the usage of a Bible verse as one of the justifications of the judge's opinion infringes on the idea of jurisdictional secularism or not. Is it really an overt breach of the principle of impartiality? Don't the judge's personal convictions interfere, if he quotes the Bible or not, with his decision-making? What if he had cited the writings of Marx or Nietzsche or Gandhi? Isn't this what jurisdictional secularism proposes? A broad and honest engagement of religious points of view in the public sphere. So why should judges be counted outside of these possibilities? Or why should state officials be prevented from engaging in public debate in such a way when individuals are free to do it? And further, if I still have at least 1 minute more, while reading Dr. Chaplin's book, I was reminded of another book, an exchange of papers between Robert Audi and Nicholas Wolterstorff on the Rawlsian liberal theory of public reason and religious participation in the public square. This book is actually amply cited by Dr. Chaplin in chapter 4. So would it be possible, Dr. Chaplin, to say in which ways was your constitutional democracy theory, which includes jurisdictional secularism, which ways is this different, or maybe supports Wolterstorff's idea of an equal voice participation? Is there a difference between the constitutional democracy, the pluralist democracy that is participatory, and the equal voice that Wolterstorff proposes? So to finish, I think this book is timely. It is valuable as a resource for scholars in different areas and for individuals to find a shield against secularist claims. And the Gordian note of the book, I think, is that a genuine constitutional democracy seeks to value the religious and non-religious voices alike, with parity, not privilege. And that is the kind of democracy that will promote human flourishing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renato. You've helped us all, and I think Jonathan too, to lift the whole discussion and send us into orbit. Thank you very much. The parity of your contribution with Jonathan's is evident. Jonathan, could you briefly reply?
Yes, thank you very much indeed, Renato. Let me echo what Bruce just said. That was a wonderfully succinct and I think accurate summary of the key argument of my book. You should have written my introduction for me, I think, then it would have come over even better. So thank you for that. So yes, let me just jump straight into your two questions, because I didn't say too much about that in my remarks. So what about the judge in South Dakota? Actually, the issue is not, of course, just about judges. It's about any state officials. The issue appears more dramatic in the case of a judge for various reasons, but the same applies to senior, civil servants or government ministers, or any representative of the state in that respect. Now, in the book, I distinguish different kinds of roles within the state, and I assign different degrees of latitude to those roles with respect to faith-based reasoning or faith-based justifications. And essentially, the fundamental distinction is between those who speak in the representative sphere, what I call the representative sphere, and those who, as it were, speak on behalf of the state, the executive branch. So in the representative sphere, that would include all citizens, political parties, all their organizations, any kind of political organization, and I argue members of parliament or Congress or something like that, those who are elected to represent the citizens. And there I say there should be virtually complete freedom to articulate political positions based on faith-based considerations. There are prudential questions that should govern how they speak and when they invoke those religious reasons, and those are very important prudential considerations, but there are no questions of legitimacy in terms of liberal constitutionalism, let's say. But then I distinguish that from state officials who speak, representatives I should say, speak on behalf of a section of the population. That's their task. A geographical section, a section of political convictions or so forth. State officials speak qua state on behalf of the whole. And they must bear that in mind as they do so. So that itself already counsels against state officials invoking the fundamental ultimate language of just one of the communities represented in society. I mean, everybody will experience how when a state official invokes a worldview, whether it's secularism or Islam or Buddhism or whatever it might be, that we fundamentally reject, there's a certain distancing or alienation going on between the state and us, because at the deepest level of our convictions and identity, we are being governed on principles that we fundamentally reject. So that's one thing. But also, this is the specific implication of state impartiality. So I think it's impossible for the state officials to actually be impartial towards diverse faiths if they're invoking only one of them. Whether that's Marxism or anything else. So that's the first, and there's more to say about that. And the gradations between what I've called the state officials and the representative sphere are not quite as clean cut as I may have suggested. There's a sort of gradation there that we could explore. On Wolterstorff, my position is essentially in accord with Wolterstorff's view. It is really an equal voice view. So I'm happy to affirm that, and I've learned from Wolterstorff on that. What I try to do is place that notion of equal voice within a larger framework as you sketched at the beginning. So an account of a constitutional government, an account of a democratic government. Wolterstorff doesn't really develop that kind of integrated political theory that includes those different dimensions. He doesn't really have a theory of the state, actually. And he has theories of lots of other things, which we're going to learn a lot from. but it doesn't have a theory of the state as such. And so that's really what I'm attempting to do, to situate that notion within a larger framework. But thank you so much. Lots more questions to